While you're getting settled in, we invite you to go ahead to the bottom toolbar of your Zoom window and open up the chat. Adjust so that you're posting to all panelists and attendees, and tell us where you're joining us from today. That's awesome that you're joining from London and Canada and lots of cool places. I love Jersey too. I might be in New Orleans, but my company's in Jersey. Mike, are you making fun of me being from Louisiana now?
Never.
If you're just joining us, we invite you to open up the chat at the bottom of the toolbar. Change it so that you're posting to all panelists and attendees, and say hello so we know where you're from. Michael, yes, it is being recorded, and we'll give a little more detail about that shortly once we get going. You are very welcome.
Welcome, everybody. So we are going to get started. It is 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And to respect your time, we're going to jump right into it. And I'm going to have Marcy start us off with those logistics, and then we'll dive into the content.
Awesome. Normally I would speak to you, but Mike, it's telling me that you stopped my video too.
Oh, I apologize.
That's okay. Right now, I'll just be the voice coming through the computer.
Perfect.
So welcome, everyone. We just wanted to welcome you to our course and thank you for being here as we talk about continuity of learning, planning effective remote teaching. So you can see Mike's face there in the window, and I'm Marcy. We both work for Eduscape, a professional learning organization that works with teachers all over the country and the world. And Mike is a senior learning leader with Eduscape. I'm the director of STEM Ed for the company. And so our goal today is to help you guys as you start to make this transition that's coming upon us very, very quickly. So without further ado, we'll look at what's coming up for us in this time. And so our agenda, we're going to focus on myths, terms, planning, Q&A. We have about 55 minutes total, and then we'll spend about 45 of that on the agenda, and we'll spend about 10 doing some Q&A and taking care of everybody. And so that will be, hey, there I am. And now we have our learner outcomes. We're going to review some simple planning tools to create your remote teaching model. We're going to look at practices, processes, and mindsets that support the online and learning environment. And we're going to identify the practical steps to help you continue your instruction online. So let's talk logistics. Here's the important stuff. We're going to ask you to put any questions into the Q&A box. While Mike is presenting, I'll be monitoring that. If it doesn't get answered right away, it may be that I'm marking that so that we can answer it live at the end. We will also be monitoring the chat box and dropping some things into you, but please do put those questions in the Q&A. You'll notice your mic and video are indeed muted. We're using the webinar feature of Zoom, and for the logistic purposes right now, there's about 63 of us in the webinar and climbing. So it keeps it a little bit simpler to not have to worry about video and mics. Also on the bottom, most of you have found your chat box, but it's really important to note that when you're in there, you're going to want to click on the blue button at the bottom and change it so that it says all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, you're only talking to me and Mike. Mike won't be able to answer you once we get going, and especially if you're sharing some useful information with the rest of the group. In the top right corner, you're able to adjust the view so you can decide which parts you want to look at. If you want to see Mike's face too while you're talking, or if you just want to see the screen, whatever makes you more comfortable for this time. And I think that covers all the logistics. Did I miss anything, Mike?
Just that the webinar will be recorded.
Okay.
So you will receive a link within the next 24 to 48 hours with this recording. It'll also be on our website for you to view. We cannot provide you with the actual slide deck, but like Marcy said, we'll be dropping resources along the way. So please use them. Use them with your professional learning communities. But we just ask that you let us know how you're using them, because we would love to just see how far our impact goes. And without further ado, welcome all of our international friends here today, as well as our States friends. We're here today to really talk about what does this remote instruction look like? Now, through the context of Mr. Jameson, he's going to be our story for today. We started this webinar last week and it was St. Patrick's Day, so we tried to be a little festive with the name. So like Mr. Jameson, many of your schools closed down as a result of COVID-19. Now, he is a 10th grade history teacher, but please just note that as we go through all of the content today, that although that's our concrete example, please consider how some of these steps and all of the vocabulary and all of the resources we give you can be translated to your grade level. Although he is our example, these can be used, these strategies can be used at any grade level at all. Now, let's take a look at Mr. Jameson's story. Now, Mr. Jameson is a 10th grade history teacher and his school closed down. I'm sure like many of you, he keeps getting these emails that are telling him about all of these tools that are free and Flipgrid this and Seesaw that. And what does that all mean? How do I even go about doing this? So Mr. Jameson starts thinking to himself, okay, online learning is easy, right? I just post articles and YouTube videos and I'm done, right? Kind of. What are these online learning terms? What do they mean? And then finally, how do I decide what to teach? In the perfect world, you have online learning where you have plenty of time to plan and build out materials that are extremely interactive using all kinds of authoring tools. But today we're going to really be focusing on what does coronavirus online planning look like? And we're going to dive into that in just a moment. But let's help Mr. Jameson plan his online instruction. So let's do this first. by starting to see how his mindset is shifting. Now let's start with some learning myths. Now, many of you might have a perception of what online learning looks like. So the way that we're going to run this first section is that I'm going to launch a poll in just a moment. This poll is going to have 5 statements on it. I'm going to read through the statements at my own pace, but feel free to go through the poll at your own pace. Now, on the poll, you have 5 statements, and underneath it will ask you, is this statement a myth or is this statement a fact? Make your selection, go through all of the questions, and then submit your answers. Then, once everyone has submitted, we'll go back through the statements one more time and just extend our learning and see how the mindsets have changed. So I'm going to launch the poll right now. If for whatever reason it's not working for you, Marcy, please just jump on and let me know. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't the first time. But let's dive into those statements. I'm sorry, Marcy?
Looks good.
Perfect, thank you. So statement number 1 says that online learning is harder for the learner. Online learning is harder for the learner. Is that a myth or is that a fact? Give you a couple moments to fill in your answers. It's harder for the learner. Let's take a look at number 2. Number 2 says that learners will look up answers to complete assignments. Learners will look up answers to complete assignments. Number 3. Number 3 says that online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Number 4, online learning is impersonal and less engaging. Online learning is impersonal and less engaging. And last, but certainly not least, planning an online learning experience is similar to planning face-to-face instruction. Planning an online learning experience is similar to planning face-to-face instruction. I'm going to give you about 10 seconds or so to kind of get those answers back into the poll, and then I'll review and extend our learning. Give you a couple more seconds. All right, educators, let's see how our thinking has changed or will change. Online learning is harder for the learner. Well, we have 51% say that's a myth and 49% say that's a fact. We are right down the middle there. Now, I think that is perfect because we believe that it really depends. Now, there are many, many factors as educators that we don't have control over in a physical classroom, let alone an online learning classroom. What do I mean by that? We don't know what type of internet access the students have. We don't know what kind of support they have. We don't know what kind of devices they have at home. So what does that mean for you? We can make online learning a bit more easier for the student as well as you if you consider 3 components of online learning. The first component is communication. This is something that we have control over as educators. Now that communication looks like this. Make sure that it's clear, make sure that it's concise, and make sure that it's consistent. So what do I mean by that? Depending on what learning management system you're using, whether it be Canvas, Schoology, Microsoft Teams, Google Classroom, whatever you're using, be sure that your students know when you're going to communicate with them, how you're going to communicate with them, where you're going to communicate with them, how frequently you're going to communicate with them, and then how long do you have to respond to their messages. So where? Are you going to use email? Are you going to use private chat? Are you going to use some other type of school management system? Frequency. Are you going to post every Monday the assignments for students and then it's due every Thursday? Are you going to offer office hours regularly so that students can pop in and ask their questions? The amount of time it takes for you to respond. Is it going to be 24 hours? Is it going to be 48 hours? Now, I encourage you to set some parameters on that communication right off the bat. Being somebody that went from the classroom into a working from home scenario that I'm in right now, is that work will follow you home because you are working at home. And what will tend to happen is that you will find yourself working a lot longer than you typically do. So setting some of those boundaries so that you are able to balance your personal life with your families, with some mental breaks as well, will help you as well as help your learners know when to communicate with you and where. Let's take a look at learning activities. When we talk about learning activities, consider the scaffolds, the directions, the supports that you put into place in your physical classroom and transform them into your digital classroom. Things like, I'm gonna do it, we're gonna do it together, and then you're going to do it. Your scaffolding, your gradual release method. Maybe that looks like me doing a short video, instructional video. And then students are gonna work together collaboratively. And then they're going to work by themselves to apply the skill or the content. If you tend to bold questions, use colors, tend to use different fonts to draw attention to text, still use those same strategies that you've been using in your physical classroom in your digital one. That'll help learners know what to focus their attention on, as well as simply know where to access content, which also brings me into that management piece. If you're going to use something like a Google Classroom or a Microsoft Teams, let your students know where you're going to be posting your content. Are you going to use topics to organize? Are you going to use channels to organize? Also consider creating assignment tags. For example, if I'm talking about Unit 1, maybe it's U1, comma, and then homework, or U1, comma, assessment. If you create these tags, students will know what to, where the documents are, number one, but number two, it'll help them organize. Remember, they're in this situation that's new to them as well. They're used to having you as a support. Now we need to consider as educators how we can develop our online learning platform in such a way that students know where to find their documents. That's the biggest thing, because think about how often they're in class and you're saying, once you finish step 4, go to the front of the room and grab a piece of paper, and they go, wait, what? Consider how you can support them in their learning at home by organizing your documents in a very meaningful way. That final piece of management is consider how you might be able to use checklists and calendars to support your students. Google Calendar integrates very nicely with Google Classroom. Maybe start identifying the assignments on your calendar as well, so that students start to get in the habit of using those tools that they have accessible to them. Then support them throughout the learning to get them to be more to become self-independent by using those. So consider how you can use those management tools to help learners along the way. So let's take a look at that second one. The second one is that learners will look up answers to complete assignments. Now, 27% say that's a myth, and 73% say that's a fact. Now, we say it depends, and you're like, Mike, what are you talking about? Well, let's take a look at this and dive a little bit deeper into the motive behind why kids would be looking for answers. Like I said earlier, at one point, students had you and other classmates to help them and to facilitate learning. If they had a question, they had somebody to ask. So there may be that aspect of learners at home not having anybody, or even if they do have supports, they may feel that anxiety of, what do I do? I'm gonna look it up online because that's what they're used to doing. So one, will they look up answers online to kind of ease their own anxiety and to kind of self-regulate? Potentially. Do you have learners that will also potentially look up answers online just to get work done quickly too? Most likely. So then that means a few things for us as educators. How can we design learning assignments, activities, and assessments to make sure that not only students are learning and they're using that content and practicing, but also that our assessments are actually evaluating the skills and the content that we mean for it to evaluate? What do I mean? Instead of doing vocabulary quizzes where students are writing definitions and synonyms and antonyms, for example, maybe they're using those words in context by writing a story or writing sentences, so we can see how they're using the words to know if they understand them or not. Maybe we're giving quizzes that are lower stakes so that the grade isn't as big and that students can complete it independently, where we're not monitoring or proctoring. Maybe your learners are doing open book and open note tests, but with a time limit, so that you're still evaluating learning, but they're using resources because they're probably going to use them anyway. Maybe you're evaluating your learners by virtually meeting with them using video conferencing tools to actually proctor a test where they're able to ask you questions right away. Now consider, of course, what are some of the features that you need to turn off so that they're not still looking or chatting with other friends. Now, this is what I encourage you when you're thinking about your assignments and your assessments. How can we structure them in such a way that we're watching that we're assessing how students are performing with that content, performance-based tasks. So maybe they're creating things, they're designing things, and not necessarily just recalling. Let's take a look at number 3. Number 3 says that online learning is as effective as face-to-face learning. Now, effectiveness really comes down to so many factors. Number 1, does the learner have support at home? Are they using a mobile device or a computer? If they don't have internet access, do they have data? If they have data, do they have unlimited data? If they have a mobile device, what types of apps should they download and what types of file formats should I deliver to them? All we can worry about as educators is how we can provide learning for our students. So what do I mean by that? Making sure that our communication is clear, making sure that our document management is clear and concise and consistent, making sure that our learning activities are accessible mobily as well. Now, there's a variety of internet sources out there, a variety of internet providers out there that are offering internet for very low costs. But Marcy can actually drop a resource for you as well that is helps you guide your activities. So what I mean by that is that if you have students that have really spotty internet, it gives you some activity suggestions. If you have students that have really high functioning internet, the resource gives you some ideas on what you can do. There's a lot that you can take into consideration, but all you can do as a teacher is to control the things that you have control over. Now let's take a look at number 4. It says that online learning is impersonal and less engaging. About 73% of you say that's a myth, and about 27% say that's a fact. Online learning can be impersonal and can be less engaging. I've taken many classes where I go on, I read, I do a quick assignment, I do a discussion post, I respond to one person, and I'm done. Very impersonal, very or not as engaging. But I've also taken online classes where I've had learners meet with me, and we do video chatting and small group instruction. We've done taken selfies of our workspace. So consider having your students take pictures of where they're working. Consider using some of the polling and survey features in your LMSs. If you're using Google Classroom, maybe consider using things like Google Forms or Microsoft Forms to see how our kids doing. Even if it's as simple as, what did you do this weekend? Maybe even using the question tool in Google Classroom as well. The more you can connect your digital space with the physical space that students are working, the more personalized this learning experience will feel. Also, as students are participating in discussion posts and are having online discussions, as educators, we should also be participating in those discussions. The more that we are actively engaged in our online learning platform, the more legitimate our online classroom will feel to the students. So engage with them. So let's talk about the less engaging portion. Now, everything I just mentioned could be also found to be more engaging, but consider how you can have kids work together. How can you have kids collaborate using tools like Google Docs or Microsoft Word? How can students meet with you in a video chat if you have that ability and your district says it's okay? And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. How can you meet with students in smaller groups? How can you differentiate learning and have those students work together and support their instruction? The more ways that you can have learners connect and build that community of your classroom, the better. Right now, everybody is feeling isolated. So the more that you can bring your students together alongside of you as well, the better. Consider also kind of reflecting on, having students reflect on their emotions and how they're doing with this, whether that be completing a little log or reflections weekly. And then helping students along the way by providing them with strategies to cope with not being with their friends or to cope with being independent, giving them strategies like checklists, giving them strategies such as workflow boards like Trello or Asana if your students are old enough to use that. Maybe it's behavior management systems. Maybe it's saying, how do you feel today? How well did you do with working and staying on focused? Those are some ways to create engaging environments and to make that learning personal. Finally, planning an online learning experience is similar to planning face-to-face instruction. We're very split on this one as well. 59% say that's a myth, 41% say that's a fact. Here's the good news. Planning in the online setting when you have all this time is very, 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 very similar to what you're already doing. Coronavirus planning is very, 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 very similar to what you're already doing. Here's the hint. When you're in your physical classroom, the actual planning of learning outcomes and your standards and your content, that's all exactly the same as when you are planning for an online instruction. The biggest difference is deciding how you're going to structure those activities with digital tools and how you're going to deliver that content. You are 50% of the way there, and I bet you're even further there once I start to talk about some of the different tools. So let's just see for a moment how Mr. Jameson's thinking has changed. So he might have been a little bit wrong about online instruction. So online instruction can be harder for learners if planning, digital organization, and communication are not clear. Learners may look up stuff online, so how he assesses their knowledge is going to have to change slightly. Online learning can be effective if he provides his learners with the supports they need to access that content. And I can't stress this enough, consistency, consistency, consistency. That is what is going to help your learners know when to communicate, how to communicate, where to find things, when to turn things in, when to meet with you. That consistency is so important. Online learning doesn't have to be impersonal or less engaging, especially if you use some of the tools he keeps getting emails about. But I'm going to encourage all of you, use what you're comfortable with for as long as you need to. This may last 2 weeks, 2 months, or for the rest of the school year, whatever it might be. Use the tools you're comfortable with. And once you have your new routines down and your planning down, then start to explore some of those other tools that are out there. Finally, he goes, oh, I already know how to plan face-to-face instruction. So planning online is simple. Online learning is similar. He's got this. But like I said, because this happens so quickly, some adjustments are going to have to be made to that planning process. And we're going to focus a lot of our time today on that last bullet point. So Mr. Jameson goes, all right, I got this. I now kind of have a better understanding of what online learning looks like. But what do all these terms mean? This asynchronous, synchronous, blended, what does this mean? There's a lot of different terms out there. So let's help him explore some of these terms and shift his mindset with that. Marcy, if she hasn't already, is going to drop you a resource that is our vocabulary list. I encourage you to use it, print it out, share it with colleagues, share it with your professional learning communities so that they are prepared and they have access to that online learning content as a result of having the vocabulary. Let's go through it. Asynchronous learning. Asynchronous learning is when learning is happening at the learner's pace, time, and place. What does that mean? On Monday, I post all of your assignments. On Thursday, you turn in your assignments. When you complete them is completely up to you, whether it's at 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. I don't care as long as you're getting your work done. It's happening at all different times and places and paces. Authoring tools. Authoring tools are the tools we use to build digital content. Now, in the private sector of instructional design or online learning, they may use these fancy tools like Captivate and Camtasia and all of these video editing software. For us as K-12 teachers, we're just using Google Docs. That's an authoring tool. We're using Google Draw or maybe even Edpuzzle to create content. Those are our authoring tools for our online classroom. Blended learning. Blended learning traditionally is a face-to-face meeting where we're in a physical location together, and then online learning is happening asynchronously. In our coronavirus case, blended learning may be that we come together on a video chat and have conversations and learn, and then asynchronous learning is happening throughout the week. So blended is a combination of face-to-face learning with asynchronous online learning. Curation. You might have heard the word curation in terms of a museum and a curator. And what they do is they collect art, they collect different pieces of exhibits to put together so that the visitors walk away with a specific idea or feeling or lasting impression. When it comes to curation as an educator, we are not just researching videos and articles and we just throw it to our students and say good luck. Instead, when we curate, we decide which articles, which videos, which pictures, which activities can I bring together so that when my learners walk away, they have met the learning outcomes. So, which articles and videos work together to meet my learning objectives? That's curating, because you're very specifically choosing resources that work together in service of assessment, in service of standards and learning outcomes. E-learning and online learning, same thing. It just indicates electronic learning, whether that be on the mobile device, on the computer, or on the Xbox, whatever it might be. Instructional design. Instructional design, guess what? You are all instructional designers. It's a fancy word for saying that you're using your cognitive learning science, your pedagogy, all of the strategies that you know how to use, and you combine it with digital authoring tools like Google Draw or Google Slides or Microsoft Word or Microsoft PowerPoint. Whatever it might be, it's the combination of learning sciences with digital tools. That's instructional design. Learning management system. Your learning management system, or your LMS, is that digital platform that you use to teach your kids. In some cases, you have more formal learning management systems like Canvas or Schoology, and some of them are more bolstered and some of them are very minimal. In some cases, you're just giving content to students, they're completing assignments and returning them to you. In other cases, you have grading systems, you're able to give feedback, you're maybe even able to host virtual classes using video conferencing tools. In many cases, our quote unquote learning management system might be Microsoft Teams because that's where our kids are learning, or it might be Google Classroom because that's where our kids are learning. It's that location where you're giving content to kids and they are interacting with you. Synchronous learning. We are synchronously learning right now. We're together on a video and it's live and you're able to ask questions and you're able to either dial in by video or you're able to dial in by your telephone, but there's often a chat feature also involved, not always, but that also brings me to video conferencing video conferencing. Sorry, my little image was over it. So video conferencing is the medium through which participants use that software to have live video, audio, or at times chat. I'm going to encourage you that if you're considering this synchronous learning, I want you to consider a few things. Number one, what does your district say about ages that can be doing this, as well as what are your compliancy requirements? Are you even allowed to meet with your students via video? If you are allowed to meet with them via video, do students have to be turned off? Can you not record? What are those guidelines that you need to know when considering synchronous video conferencing? There's lots of things to consider, so just double check with your admin and your district. Also consider that when you think about internet issues at home, there's a lot of parents at home working and using Wi-Fi bandwidth. Consider if it's not necessary to video conference, are there other options that you can choose that can still facilitate the same type of learning? Now, Mr. Jameson has always wondered what LMS was, but now he knows. So knowing the online learning terms are going to help him as he does his research and builds his online content. Again, we don't know how long this is going to last. Maybe it's 2 weeks, 2 months, or the rest of the year. As he starts to dive in and get into professional educator communities and start to have these conversations about remote learning, now he has these terms as background knowledge. I urge you to share this with your learners as well as your parents. They might be wondering what the terms are too, because a lot of your parents went from being maybe working as a professional in a private business to now being a homeschooler. Maybe they were a salesperson and now they're a homeschool parent. So having them and preparing them with these terms will just help them along the way. You also might start using this terminology in your classes. So I would encourage you to let your learners know. So if you say, guys, we're going to meet asynchronously or synchronously, whatever it might be, they know what you're talking about. Finally, decide if you want to meet asynchronously or synchronously or blended. Again, I urge you to check with your districts to see what your guidelines are, but decide how you want to meet with your students and then stay consistent with that decision. Mr. Jameson says he's going to be a professional ID in no time. So he's already using that lingo right. So we've seen how Mr. Jameson's mentality has changed from what online learning was, what he thought it was rather, to what it is. And now he understands the terms. But the question a lot of us might be wondering is, okay, Mike, I don't have a lot of time. I can't cover everything. I'm only doing 2 hours of instruction. I'm not seeing my kids every day. How do I decide what to teach? Let's dive into a very practical 6-step process that will help you decide what to teach. There are bit.lys down at the bottom, but Marcy's also going to drop it up in the chat for you, or rather down in the chat for you, so that you can use it for your own planning purposes. Again, feel free to share it out with your professional learning communities. We just like to know if you're using it, to know how far our impact is going. So please drop us an email and just let us know how you're using it. I'll give you that information at the end. But let's take a look through this 6-step process. The first one is inventory, taking inventory. A lot of you probably dropped into this planning process really quickly because you went from a Friday of being in face-to-face with your students to Monday to going right onto online learning. So I urge you to take a couple minutes and think, what technology do I have at my disposal? What do my students have at their disposal? What do I need to cover between now and the end of the week, and next month, and then by the end of the year? Just take an inventory and reflect on what you have. Number 2, identify learning outcomes. What are those non-negotiable learning outcomes that you have to hit such that your students are prepared for next unit and next year? We want to minimize those learning gaps as much as possible. Identify assessments. How will you assess your learning outcomes? How are you going to assess your students? Identify content delivery method. How are you going to teach your students those outcomes? How are you going to create your learning activities? What are you going to use to create them? Number 5, identify learning materials. What digital worksheets or digital resources do you already have? What do you need to curate? And what do you need to create? Finally, content delivery. How are you going to deliver the content? Now that's a quick overview of our 6-step process. We're going to dive a lot deeper into it in just a moment. But please note, we're using Mr. Jameson's 10th grade example as a concrete example. The process can be applied to elementary school, middle school, or high school. So I encourage you that as I go through this, I know I'm using a 10th grade example. Think about how that translates to your grade level in particular to help you and your colleagues along the way. I'm also going to stop at various points to allow you to take notes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the next slide, go through it, and then give you a couple minutes, or a couple seconds rather, to get some notes down. So your first one is taking inventory. Reflect on your technology tools. What do you feel comfortable with? What do you feel semi-comfortable with? And what do you want to know how to use? Sometimes that may be, Mike, I just want to get comfortable with Google Classroom, and that is perfect. Stick with that. We're all at different levels, so just reflect on what you have technology-wise. Then reflect on what your content goals are. Think about what you have to finish between now and the end of the month, and the end of the next month, and then the end of the next month. And just start to get a gauge as to where you're at and where you have to go. So for example, if we're using Mr. Jameson's concrete example, he doesn't have any technology tools filled in. So I'm actually going to stop in just a couple seconds and let you fill in some of those right now. But look at all the content he still has to cover for the rest of the year. He's got a lot, but that's okay. I'm going to stop for just a couple seconds, write down some technology tools that you feel comfortable with and you have accessible. Now, I'm sure there's a lot more that you'll be able to write down in just a couple seconds or a couple minutes. Let me dive into that next step. The next step is identifying your learning outcomes. I encourage you, grab your end of the year assessment or grab your end of unit assessment and say, what is the most important learning I need my students to do in order to achieve this? What do I mean by that? Identify your non-negotiable learning that is needed for that next unit or next year. So you look at your assessment and say, what are those pieces that my kids have to know to do well next unit and that my kids have to do well next year? Then write your learning outcomes based off of that. In many cases, you already have learning outcomes. Just identify the ones that you need to make sure that you hit. Finally, just make sure that it all aligns. Do your standards and your outcomes make sense together? Do your standards and your outcomes align to your end of unit or end of year assessment? So let me do a quick recap. Grab those assessments. Say to yourself, What do my kids have to know for next year or next unit? Then say to yourself, what are those learning outcomes that will get me there? And then look, does this all make sense? Is it aligned? I'm going to give you guys a couple seconds to write some notes down. Let's see how Mr. Jameson applied this. So Mr. Jameson took his state examination in global history. That's his end of the year assessment. Then he grabbed his end of unit assessment for World War I in particular. And he said to himself, okay, these are the 4 components of my end of unit assessment for World War I. Now, let me take a look at my standards. Oh goodness, I have a lot of standards to hit. I can't hit all of these. I can't hit all of the end of the unit assessment tasks. Okay, and now I have 7 learning outcomes. I need to look at my end of year assessment, end of unit assessment and say, what do my kids have to know for next year or next unit? So Mr. Jameson identified, okay, these 3 standards in blue are the most important when it comes to next year. They need to know how to cite textual evidence. They need to know how to analyze a series of events, and they need to be able to determine the central ideas in primary and secondary sources. Now he says to himself, which learning outcomes would support those standards? Takes a look at those learning outcomes, and he identified that the first 3 really get his students to achieving those standards. Then he looks at his end of unit assessment and says, okay, which of those components of my end of unit assessment will address the learning outcomes? He realized that tasks 1 and 2 would assess learning outcome 1, 2, and 3. And because learning outcome 1, 2, and 3 are assessed, those top 3 standards are also assessed. So he's working backwards by starting with this assessment and thinking, what are the learning outcomes and the standards that are going to be hit? Now, Mr. Jameson has to identify those assessments. So his end of unit assessment, he knows that he's going to hit those 2 tasks. But what are those other formative assessments and other summative assessments that he's going to have to create? How is he going to check student progress along the way? How is he going to see how all of this comes together and see how the students apply their new information? He has to decide on that. Then he has to decide, am I going to have to build new assessments, or am I going to have to modify ones that I already have? Well, I already have quizzes 1, 2, and 3 that hit learner outcomes, then I'm just going to keep using those, just turn them into digital quizzes. Now, I might have to change my summative assessment, so I'm going to have to build a new one. So decide what your formative and summative assessments are, then decide if you need to build or modify ones. I'm going to give you a couple moments to write down some notes. So Mr. Jameson identified that his unit summative assessment is going to be these 2 tasks. Then he realized that in service of the summative assessments, that it would be helpful to have 2 quizzes along the way, his formative assessments. He knows that quiz 1 hits learning outcome 1, and quiz 2 hits learning outcome 2 and 3. So he's going to make sure he digitizes those. So he also has his situation, which is this is his unit summative assessment. It was just giving you a quick view of what it might look like. So he identified what his summative assessments are, and he identified what his formative assessments are. Now he has to decide how he's going to deliver that content. What's the method of creating his learning activities that are going to prepare your students and to give them access to that ending assessment? So step 1 says that how are you going to engage students with your content? How are you going to teach them those content pieces? Then how are you going to have them practice the skills? So when you're determining the content and the skills, think about what you are comfortable with making. What do I mean by that? Are you going to create interactive activities where kids are working together to engage with the content? Maybe kids are going to be watching videos and reading articles and synthesizing information. Think about how you're going to deliver that content and those skills. But consider a few pieces. This is step number 3. The few components that you should consider is accessibility. Number 1, can students access this on their mobile phones? Is it accessible to my students who are at various reading levels? Is it accessible to my students who might have visual or auditory impairments? And how you might address that. Screen time. Consider the screen time of your learners. For the younger learners, is an hour or two sitting in front of a screen consecutively the best choice? Is 30 minutes the best choice? Consider what that screen time is for all levels and try to take that into consideration. Think about consistency. Are you using similar activities and similar ways of delivery each time to facilitate that learning? Validity. How valid is the learning for the students? How valid is the assessment, rather, and the evaluation that you're giving to your students? What do I mean by that? Are you actually assessing what you're intending to assess? If you're giving them a quiz, are you assessing the learner outcomes that will yield valid results, or can learners just look up the answers online? Are the learning activities actually in service to that final assessment so that it's preparing them? So think about the validity of your testing scores, your assessments, as well as, are kids learning what I want them to learn? I'll give you a couple of minutes to take notes. So Mr. Jameson, he identified 8 activities that he thought would be in service of the final assessment. He identified close readings, carousel stations, analyzing impacts using citing evidence and support analysis, looking into research, pre-writing, drafting, revisions, and then a video brief. Now, he's not going to say to his students, you're doing all of these this week. He just identified for himself that students need to complete these 8 activities in order to access that assessment at the end. So let's look into the learning materials. Now that I have those 8 activities, let me take an inventory of what I already have. Let me go into my binders and my digital binders and see what articles, what activities, worksheets, videos, whatever it might be that you use to teach that content, what do you have? Then decide what you need to curate and find. Finally, decide what you need to create. We have a nice chart for you to kind of help structure that thinking. After you've gone through that thought process, curate and build the resources that you need. Sometimes building your resources is turning in that paper copy into a digital resource. Sometimes it is filming a short screencasting using Screencastify or some other video software. Whatever it might be, is think about what you have, think about what you need to curate and find, and then what do you need to create, and then do it. So let me just go to that next slide so you can see that Mr. Jameson identified that he has some videos, some readings, and some rubrics. Now, he needs to find a couple articles, a couple organizers, maybe tips for creating a video brief that he can give to his students as a handout, and then maybe some tools for recording videos for the project. Maybe he needs to pull those together. And then he realized that he has to come up with the close reading and the station questions. So by giving yourself this organization tool, you're kind of just helping yourself as well as other colleagues, especially if you're doing this alongside of them. You'll be able to divvy out the work so that everybody can work together. And if you're by yourself, you have an organization unit that will help facilitate that. Let's go to that next and last step. Number 1 says determine how you will digitally organize your learning material. How are you going to put it in a classroom? How are you going to tag your assignments? How are you going to let students know how you organized your activities? And then determine your format. Are you going to come together synchronously or asynchronously? Mr. Jameson used this table. Now, of course, he has 10th grade, so he can do this. But this might look different for your elementary or middle school. But he identified his learning tags as assignment 1, quiz 1, unit 5, performance task. He identified next that he's going to put a date and then the name of the assignment. He went so far as to say, okay, assignment 1 is going to be a whole class instruction where we're going to meet asynchronously on this date. Assignment 2 is going to be whole class instruction and we're going to meet on this date. Assignment 3 and 4 are going to be independent homework. Now, I know you're looking at this going, Mike, he has stuff scheduled out to April. That's amazing. Don't feel like you have to do that. That is just an example. Sometimes you're just thinking about what you're doing tomorrow and then the end of the week and next week, and that is okay. But what's important is consistency, so that every time you post, you're following these same norms, these same routines, and the same way of identifying assignments, quizzes, and assessments. So, Mr. Jameson realized it's not as daunting as he thought. Planning for instructional continuity boils down to a few things. Determining what the needs of the learners are and what they need to know for next unit and next year. You might have to adjust and align some of that non-negotiable learning outcomes with assessments and learning activities. So making sure that your activities help your students access the assessment at the end. Then decide how you want to deliver it in the content in a clear and consistent and concise way. He's feeling confident and ready to go. Now, let's discuss. I'm sure your brain is wielding with a lot of different thoughts in your head, and we want to make sure that we answer your questions. Over the next couple seconds and minutes, please drop your questions into the Q&A. We want to make sure that we're answering them so that you feel prepared.
Okay, and in the meantime, while they're getting settled, I do have one question ready for you, Mike.
Perfect, let's go.
So I thought this one was worth sharing with everybody. The question was, what online tools would work well to make sure that the social emotional status of the children or relationships with the children are maintained?
It's a great question. Marcy, do you want to answer that one, or would you like me to?
I'll throw in some and then I'll let you add on.
Absolutely.
First of all, if you have something like Google Forms that's accessible, build a Google form with a couple of questions. Even something that puts a picture and asks them how it makes them feel, or how are you feeling today? A few quick little questions to make it easy. There's also something that we are working with called School Day. And School Day is a company that does work with wellness, and we'll provide some contact information in a little bit where you could contact us for more information. And my Canadian friends, I was told that there's a pilot about to start there. So we'll have a specific person for you to contact if that's something of interest.
Absolutely. And I also think that that social emotional learning piece can be done as well as, like, if you have Google Classroom and asking students questions and just saying, what are some hangups that you had this week? And then discussing some strategies. Or maybe it's providing strategies weekly. It's saying, try this checklist out this week, or try this out. And I think that just helps the students and it makes them feel connected. It also is, as they're trying to navigate this, they may need a little bit of help navigating those coping skills and those strategies. So the more support we can give those students, they may not outright say, hey, I need help in this area. Most likely they won't, especially depending on your age group. They may not realize that they need that help. So by providing resources, providing suggestions, meeting with students in small groups just to say, hey, how are you guys doing? Might be another way that you're able to support that social emotional learning.
And right now, those are all the questions I have, Mike.
That's okay. So as you're still thinking, I'm just going to go to the next slide and talk for a couple moments. If you still have questions, please pop them into the Q&A though. I just want to tell you about a quick program that we have developed, not only for educators, but for school leaders and students and those at-home stakeholders. We created this program called Remote Schoolworks. And the reason we created this program was to help everybody navigate this situation. Now, for everybody, it's going to look different. So what we mean by that is that maybe you want somebody to go through your Google admin console, for example, Marcy, and audit it and say, what settings should I have turned on? What should I be doing so that my students are able to access everything that they should be? Maybe it's saying, Mike, can you walk me through how to make Google Classroom? I really need some help with that. Maybe it's office hours where you're sitting with a bunch of us learning leaders who have been teachers for 7+ years, and you're saying, Mike, I've never done this before. Can you give me some ideas? I have these ideas. How do you do it? We also created these manuals that you see in front of you, or guides rather, that will help you kind of access how do you create community and communication and learning in the online setting. If you want to know more about the Schoolworks program, please reach out to Alex at Eduscape or Lainey at Eduscape if you're in the United States. And if you are in Canada, to reach out to Adam at Eduscape. He's our global director of Eduscape. He actually might be in the chat as well. But we want to come alongside of you and help you to make sure that you are supported through this, because we know this is a trying time and we don't want you to feel that like you're alone. But I do see some chats and Q&A. Is there any questions that we should be answering, Marcy?
There were a few more that popped up. I had a bit of a lag, so I kind of spammed the chat there for a minute.
No problem.
Sorry about that. Since they're learning and building classes on the fly, it makes sense to keep things as simple as possible, bare bones to deliver content to elementary age students. So you want me to hit that one, Mike?
Go for it, yep.
What we've been recommending is exactly what you said, keeping it simple. If you have access to something like Classroom, And even if it's the parents are logging in to help the kids access materials to make it easy to flow out, you can keep it simple with things like docs and slides, which would allow you to either allow them to create something, you to share something, or everybody to collaborate. One other tool we've been recommending that's not as well known is something called Jamboard. It's also part of Google, does have to be turned on in the admin console. So if it doesn't work, that's why. But it is a virtual whiteboard software, super simple, but great if you wanted to maybe show a problem or have a student write on something. And we've been trying to kind of keep it there. If you video and you're using Google, consider Google Meet, just because it keeps it all in the Google ecosystem. And anything you can do to keep that workflow simple is great. And remember too, it's okay if they maybe do something and send you a picture of it. It doesn't have to be complicated.
And that's what actually I was going to say, that in the chat, Jacqueline asked that same idea. Google Worksheets, how would you format them for 3 and 4-year-olds? I would recommend not necessarily creating a worksheet. I guess it really depends on what your goals are. Sometimes showing them a picture and having them write things down on a piece of paper or a slate, like a whiteboard, and then taking pictures and giving it back to you might, by posting on Google Classroom or using things like Class Dojo, Seesaw, whatever it might be that you're familiar with. That's one way that they can have information be given back to you. Obviously, there is parent involvement with that process. So with an actual worksheet, we don't know if our parents have printers at home, if those printers have ink, if those printers are hooked up. So the more we can keep that content either online or being able to have students do things just on like a scratch paper, that would be good, so that parents aren't printing off paper.
Yep. And I think some of what he just said also plays into the last question that's in the Q&A about making worksheets digital. There are also, the ability to scan PDFs and use something like Kami, Kami, which is an add-on for Google. But it's okay if you send them something and they work on it digitally and send it back with something like Kami, or if they just complete it with whatever they have, take pictures. We're going to just have to be patient with ourselves and each other at this point.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really good message to kind of leave you on, is that we are here for you. We want to support you in this journey, and we want to support your parents, your school leaders. We want to support your students. If you think of questions in the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever it might be, because that's how I often work. I think about it later and I go, oh goodness, I wish I could have this question answered. Please drop us an email at info@Eduscape. That is a really, really good resource for you, that as you're thinking about these things, drop that question in there. We also are going to be offering webinars in the next coming days, and next week is still being planned out. Things like getting started with Google Classroom, remote instruction for early ed. We're offering that twice tomorrow. So go to the events page if you want to be a part of that. We're also delivering 2 other webinars on Friday. One of them is, what is the Google equivalent to my physical classroom? So Google Classroom, Slides, all of those. And then what is the Microsoft version of my physical classroom? So that's going to be offered on Friday, those 2 different ones. The final piece I want you to look at is that Facebook group. We just launched it today, so there may not be a ton of activity, but we believe in the power of connectedness and community. And whether you're in London or Canada or in Texas, wherever you might be, we want to bring this community of educators together because there is a lot of knowledge, a lot of expertise, a lot of solutions to problems that are already out there. And because of that, we want to bring you all together to ask those questions. How do I support my 3-year-olds? How do I support my 12th graders? How do I do this? And crowdsourcing that information and those resources. So please jump into that group, ask questions, share resources, whatever it might be. We created it for you so that you're able to feel like you're part of a community, because you are, and it's there. We just have to connect you, and we're using the Facebook group to do so. So please join that. And then the final logistical piece is that as you log out, you're going to get a survey. Please fill out that survey. We do read those results. We do hone our work accordingly so that we are able to support you and create content that is meaningful, authentic, and truly supports you where you're at. So I do see a question that was popped in.
Yep.
Go ahead, Marcy.
You got her? Go ahead.
I did not. I can't see it.
Oh, that's why I was like, wait, you knew that? Can you repeat what to use for the digital whiteboard? In Google, it's called Jamboard, Jamboard. If you go to jamboard.google.com, it'll be there.
Absolutely.
If you have access.
And we thank you all for coming. We know that your time is so valuable, especially right now. So to spend an hour with us is a lot, and we appreciate it. Thank you for being here today. We're here for you. Contact us if you need us, but we appreciate you. You're doing a great job. I know you feel like you're a little bit behind on the 8 ball or that this is a lot, but I promise you, you're doing a great job. So keep doing it. We're here for you. And thank you so much for joining us today.